Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's been a while since our last opportunity to speak with someone because of the Chagim, but today we have a very special someone, and that's Dr. Naomi Grumet, who is the founder and also the executive director of the Eden Center, an organization that really has pioneered efforts on behalf of education and training around the mikvah. Dr. Grumet has her PhD in sociology from Bar-Ilan University, and her dissertation and research centered on around a lot of the same issues that she deals with now professionally. Dr. Grumet, I thank you so very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. This is such a pleasure.
No, it's my pleasure, and it's a lot of fun because this is something I don't get to talk that much about in a public setting. And that's the question of really the mikvah, the experience, and how people are trying to make that entire experience of women using a mikvah better. I guess that's the simplest way of saying it. Now, I understand you have trained thousands of people. What does it mean to train a person regarding being a mikvah attendant or a kala teacher or a chatan teacher?
So the Eden Center really works in the space of trying to make the mikvah a resource that speaks to women today, not just because it's an ancient tradition that we do, but that we can connect to it. And that mikvah should inform our lives positively, not in the narrow sense of this is a mitzvah that I have to keep, but rather based on the research and based on my talking to hundreds of people in research, what are the areas that mikvah touches on? We don't really talk about it very often. But when I began to ask people about what does mikvah mean to you, and I asked them, what is your experience of going to the mikvah? I didn't really hear that much about relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and my spiritual experience of going to the mikvah. I would ask people about what does it mean to you go to the mikvah, and do you like going to the mikvah? So women would talk to me about different kinds of things. I also interviewed men in my doctorate. So I heard their perspective. And when I would say, what does it mean? So women would say things like, I was told that if I keep this mitzvah, then I'm going to have a beautiful family. But I just had 2 miscarriages. I don't know if I'm going to have a family. It's so painful when I go. It's hard for me to talk about it. And I would ask other people, and, again, I'm going to bring up topics that not everybody talks about, but when I would ask people about going to the mikvah, and they would say, well, I don't really like going and standing in front of somebody else. I don't always feel so comfortable standing in front of another person when I'm not dressed and they are. And I kind of check it off because I know I have to do it. And then I come home and I check off what I have to do afterward because I have to do that. And I said, what do you mean? When you come home, that's when you and your husband get to reunite and be intimate together. It's not so good. It's not. And, that kind of lit up all kinds of things for me. Those are things we don't really talk about in our community so much. But perhaps mikvah gives us the opportunity. So there were also women who I interviewed who, when I asked them about the experience of mikvah, said, well, mikvah, I like mikvah because my husband can be a little bit aggressive. And what she meant was my husband is abusive. And this is the only place in my life where I can control what happens. So if I don't go exactly on time, then I give myself that break. And she was using mikvah as a tool to protect herself. And when I listened to all these stories, I really understood that mikvah is a woman's space, but that it intersects with so many different things in women's lives. And obviously couples also, because men also have feelings about this, about, coming back into an intimate relationship and making sure that their wives feel comfortable at the mikvah, because what happens at the mikvah obviously does come home afterward. And I understood that mikvah, we're talking about body, we're talking about fertility, we're talking about how we feel about our relationship, we're talking about how we feel about intimacy, we're talking about a whole conglomeration of different things, and somehow we need to address those. So when speaking about training people in this field, it became very clear to me in the context of Eden that training around mikvah and training kalot and chatanim when they get married needs to not only emphasize and focus on the actual halachot, but also has to take into account the real person and the ups and downs of life and the different things that are going to happen during the life cycle. So a mikvah attendant needs to be aware of different things that a woman might come with. And she needs to be sensitive to the fact that two people who are crying in the mikvah could be crying about completely different things. One could be crying out of excitement that maybe this will be the month that she gets pregnant and she fills up with emotion. And the next person could be crying because she's going home to an abusive husband and she doesn't know how to deal with that. And those are very different things. So the training that we've done is to really open people's eyes and in the space of mikvah to understand that mikvah has to be welcoming and accessible to every single person, not because they deserve that, but also because it pays forward, right? Every woman feeling comfortable in the mikvah means every couple having a different experience when the woman comes home, which means every family being created, the relationship of the partners being so different as it starts out each month.
So just one small question I should have asked early on. How long ago did you found the Eden Center?
We started the Eden Center as a group of women in Jerusalem who wanted to create a mikvah spa, center that was body, mind, and soul. And we spent the first 3 years or so trying to do that in the constellation of Jerusalem. But for the last 7 years, we've been doing trainings around Israel. And when we train mikvah attendants, which this year has really expanded internationally because Corona had some advantages. One of the advantages is what we're doing here now. We all discovered Zoom in a completely different way, and webinars are possible. So
do you find in the people you're training, whether it's now during the almost post-COVID, please God, or prior, that there's specific segments of a community who are open to this kind of training, or does it cross boundaries?
So that is a very interesting question. Our training for mikvah attendants started out concentrating on the non-halachic parts. We deal with a whole series of different topics, whether it's abuse or past sexual abuse, whether it's postpartum depression, OCD, fear of water, obviously communication and sensitivity, and infertility and sensitivity toward issues like that. And what I found when we were dealing with different communities is that mikvah attendants see the gamut. They see everything. So they know that all these kind of things exist. And women who work in the mikvah, whatever community they come from, and I have to say that in different parts of Israel and in different parts of the world, there are many mikvah attendants who are from the more Haredi community, but depending on what the type of community is. So in small yeshuvim, the mikvah attendant will be from the yeshuv, and she could be Dati Leumi woman who lives on that yeshuv. And in some mixed yeshuvim, there are women who, some non-religious and religious women. So it could be a whole mix of different people, but usually the mikvah attendants are more religious. But they see every kind of woman come to the mikvah. And they understand that, infertility doesn't only hit one type of population. And they understand that abuse happens across the community, or whatever the topic that we're talking about.
Is their role more a role of identifying and then triaging the woman to some other kind of support? Are they providing support themselves?
So we always say that mikvah attendants are first responders in the community, meaning that if they see that something comes up, or if they sense that there's something going on for a woman, then first of all, the mikvah is a space of, one person can reach out to another and say, I'm here for you. We're a community. That's what a community is. You don't have to go through things alone. But certainly mikvah attendants, if a mikvah attendant happens to be a therapist, so she could put on that other hat. But as a mikvah attendant, Her job is to help the woman to be tovo. And therefore, knowing how to refer and just saying there are so many resources out there. I want to refer you to somebody, or I know of places, I'm happy to share that information with you if you want, is what we see as their job. But there are certain things like women with OCD. That is a really difficult thing. And there are untold number, there are a lot of the population that suffers with some kind of OCD. It comes out in mikvah. So they have to help them.
And how does Eden Center interface with the rabbinic leadership in the communities where they operate, or in the rabbanut or whatever? How does that work?
So we welcome the rabbinic voices that are there, because, in the community, we're not going to be in every community all the time. And it's an important thing that the rabbanim also are on board and supportive. Sometimes, I left the States a long time ago, so I'm not as current with it. In Israel, I would not say that mikvah attendant is necessarily the most prestigious and highest level job always, but I always find that the mikvah attendants are so dedicated and really mosrot nefesh for Am Yisrael. They can be there till all hours. And sometimes we don't give them enough credit. So the rabbinic leadership in support of, we always try to work with rabbinic leaders who are there. It's sometimes very interesting to see the shifts that happen in that very interesting intersection of sensitivity. One of the areas of sensitivity that's needed in mikvah is to accept that there could be different psak, and different people in different communities will come with different psak. And part of welcoming somebody and part of accepting them in the mikvah is to understand that she may have a psak that is different from the psak that the mikvah attendant herself would follow, or sometimes then the local rav would give. And that's a very fine balance. Sometimes that can be a really interesting point to work out. Is it the woman's responsibility? That certainly the Eden Center believes that it is the woman's responsibility to determine who is the rabbinic voice and halachic voice that she's going to follow. And it's very important for the mikvah attendants to respect that.
It sounds like what you're doing sounds completely admirable. Or as we would say in the States, almost like mom and apple pie, something you couldn't disagree with. But nothing in Jewish life lives without something being disagreed to. Have there been pushback? Is there resistance? Have you had to deal with really complicated problems when people hear we're coming in to train the mikvah attendants?
So, there are places. So first of all, it is pretty simple. And when it comes to the mikvah attendants, they think it's pretty simple, except there are different attitudes within halacha also, and within different communities. So I would say that in terms of the challenges, there have been two lines of major challenges. One, and I don't want to stereotype, but there are certain types of individuals, and even within certain communities, where there's a harder time accepting that somebody else might have a halachic position that would be correct if it's different from mine. Mm-hmm. And that is a real challenge to overcome that and say, but harav, that is, a source that we have to follow. And that can be very, very challenging because in order to make the mikvah open and welcoming and accessible, you have to have that attitude. So for us, it's been challenging sometimes to break through an attitude that says there's only one right way halachically, and I'm going to tell you what it is. And to change the attitude of I'm here to facilitate what you want in halacha, that can sometimes be a challenge. And also, I'll tell you what an interesting challenge has been with the rabbanim sometimes. Firstly, I won't say his name, but when we first started our programming, I asked somebody who at the time was a person who was considered one of the gedolim in Israel. I said to him, I want to teach the mikvah attendants about these types of topics, about abuse and about breast cancer. And he said, there's no room for that in mikvah. Mikvah is about a woman coming so she can go home to her husband. And I said, but, if we explain about different things, they could go home happier. And especially when it came to putting up posters about breast cancer. The common response that I got from Rabbanim, and that still in Israel is often the case, is that the mikveh is not the place to think about that. To which my response is, but this is the natural place to think about it, because she has to examine her body. She's, has time for herself. And if she doesn't do it now, chas v'shalom, it's true that the mikvah night might be affected if she finds the lump. But what will happen the next month if she doesn't, or 2 months down the line? That kind of thinking and that attitude, that has been one of the challenges to overcome. But I can tell you that there's been a huge shift in the last 7 years. And I even see an enormous shift, because we work a lot with mikvah ladies who are in the Haredi community. There's been an enormous shift in the willingness and the readiness of the communities, for example, to admit that there is abuse in the communities. And there's a thirst.
And have you found, I'm not asking for statistics on this, but have the mikvah attendants been able to save lives?
Yeah,
whether because of abuse or
I could tell you stories. I'll tell you in the abuse realm, and Eden does much more than just these things. And sometimes it sounds like all the crazy cases. Our major goal is to make mikvah an empowering space and to create conversations about healthy intimacy for everybody, and not just, those that we want to save lives and save marriages. But there was one case that sticks out of my mind of a woman who came to the mikvah, and the mikvah attendant was in our course at that time. And the woman did not make any eye contact. Can I please have my room? She didn't look up at the mikvah attendant even once. And the mikvah attendant said, "Good evening. Come, I'll take you to your room." And even during the tefillah and afterward, when she was, wishing her well, the woman did not look up. And because she was in our course, this mikvah attendant felt like something is not right. And when the woman got dressed, she took her to the side and she said, "I feel like something's bothering you. I don't want you to go home with something heavy on your heart. You should leave here feeling good." "No, everything's okay." She said, "I'm here to talk. If you need anything, I don't want you to leave feeling like you can't." And it opened something up. And it turned out that this woman was the wife of a Rosh Yeshiva, and that he was abusive to her, and it seemed to the mikveh attendant also to their 9 children. And the mikveh attendant said, "No, you don't have to go through that." And the woman said, "Who's going to believe me? He's a Rosh Yeshiva. Who's going to believe me? There's nowhere I can turn." And so the mikveh attendant said to her, "No, here is a number. This is an anonymous hotline. You don't have to tell them your name, but you don't deserve to go through that." And the thing that the woman was most concerned about was the shidduchim of her children, if somebody would find out. So the mikveh attendant, having had our training, was able to say, "But you don't want them to go through that too. If you can get help now, and you can save them also." So that was, and then there were other, there's so many stories about, really breast cancer, women who come to the mikvah and say, "Something's bothering me here. Just take a look, because anyway, you see me. Can you just take a look?" And the woman's like, "If you have bleeding, something's wrong. I'll recommend the people who came to talk to us. There's the great doctors here. You have to go get checked." So one particular case, a woman who, worked at Bank Yisrael, had a very high job. The mikveh attendant said, "No, you have to go get checked." And it was stage 1. Thank God it was stage 1 and not further. So they really are able to identify. Of course, it's a fine line also, because we don't want mikveh attendants intruding.
Right.
We want mikveh attendants supporting.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that the Eden Center had done some lobbying in the Knesset regarding laws that govern mikvahs. What were you able to accomplish legally?
So a few years ago, we began to train because of what was clear to us, that much of what happens in the mikvah is interpersonal, right? Everybody has their own halachic things, and there's one very specific thing that you have to do. But what is really special and beautiful about the mikvah is that women can be there and help women. But it was clear to us that in most places, in Jerusalem, for example, in order to train to be a mikvah attendant, you needed to have 100 hours of halacha. And keep in mind that to be a mikvah attendant, you need to be 12 in a day and see that the woman went all the way under the water. That is halachically the entire job of a mikvah attendant. So 100 hours of halacha is a lot of halacha, but they didn't learn anything about interpersonal. And so we lobbied the government officials that it was not in keeping with the job, especially as an institution which is state run, that there would be no training at all in well-being, safety, crisis situations, how to identify abuse. And in 2018, it was actually put into law that mikvah attendants who are hired by the state of Israel must go through training that includes halacha, but also includes a series, CPR, and a series of things that are actually able to help them be first responders and so we're very proud of that change.
It sounds amazing. Now, one area we keep on focusing on is the saving of lives. But when you started, Ed, and you started about spirituality and mental health and bringing the mikvah to a very strong and positive piece, how does that still happen?
So that really, I must say, is our focus in many ways. Both through intimacy education, by creating resources. And really, I think, we've just spoken a lot about the crisis situations, but the most important thing I believe in our training is when mikvah attendants come to the end of their training and kala teachers come to the end of the training and recognize that, women today need to feel safe and comfortable and own this mitzvah in a different way and have a voice. And that actually is what affects the family, right? When we feel positive about intimacy, when we're able to talk about things, when we explore different things together and know within the context of halacha that that's permitted, that is what makes it, positive and enjoyable. So we spend a lot of our time doing that work.
And do you find that the mikvah experience, women go to the mikvah, when there's a crisis, I understand the mikvah attendant pulling the woman to the side and saying, can I speak to you? Do you want to talk? But about the issues of spirituality and intimacy and all of those other issues, how does that enter into the time where the woman is in the mikvah?
So that's not always for the mikvah attendant to discuss. But I'll tell you, this year we had a woman who's a mikvah attendant for 30 years, and she came to our course, and all of a sudden she said, oh my gosh, I see the spiritual potential within mikvah like I never understood it before. And now I understand my job so differently. My job is to make space for somebody to have there, not to stand on top of her, not to make sure, check everything, but to give her that space to encounter something. And the water in Parashat Breshit, which we just had, the water pulls back and allows everything else to come out. And if we can tap in the pasuk, this is the first time that mikvah appears in Parashat Breshit, Vayikavu hamayim. So when that happens, that is actually the potential in creation, and God uses the water to create everything in the world. So if we're able to tap into those same forces, and if somebody's able to step back and let women experience that power of the water, that is actually, how people can relate to the spiritual life.
And you were talking, the Rabbanut had a requirement in Yerushalayim of 100 hours of halachic education. How many hours of contact do you have with the mikvah attendants? What's the education of Eden?
So the Eden course is a 18 times 4 is how much? 72-hour course. And during that, we have 24 hours of halachic education, and the rest of the hours are on the spiritual sides of mikvah, the communication, the sensitivity. You know, why you asked me just before, like, how do other people experience it? And really, it is about giving space to the woman, about knowing how to respect her privacy, about asking her, how can I be here for you? Do you want me to? And then there's a few things that it could be, and really allowing women's voices and that experience to come out. And again, as I said, and with college teachers also understanding that, wait, we have to have discussions about what's good in our relationship when we come home also. Do we have to feel like on mikvah night, there's only one model that we can follow, or within our relationship, we're able to figure it out? Those kind of voices are equally important.
And now you started expanding outside of Israel. If people want to contact, and people, mikvah attendants, if organizations which run mikvahs want to reach out to the attendant center, beyond the URL, the link that's right behind your on the background, the www.attendantcenter.com, how do people do it?
It really is as easy as info@theattendantcenter.com. They can look us up. But right now we're about to have, we didn't speak about this, but one of the resources that we're about to publish in the States, and I hope will reach a lot of people, is a beautiful resource called Birkat Emunah that discusses infertility and mikvah, and is really a support for women and couples. There's a husband's compendium, which discusses mikvah night from both perspectives, and we're hoping to get it out. So if people want to reach out also to bring that to their community, we would be thrilled to send copies to different communities. But people can look us up on the internet, Instagram, Facebook.
Everything is available, and you're available. And in the
we
center,
just did a cohort of 20 women in Australia, a dedicated course in Australia to learn to be college teachers, because they wanted to have the holistic training that deals not only with halacha, but also with intimacy, birth control, women's well-being, all kinds of
full gamut. And in Israel, is there something like licensure to be a mikvah attendant, or it just has to be an approval?
No. Our training that we do for mikvah attendants is approved by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. We had to become an organization that is officially approved on the list. We, have to give them our syllabus and all the materials. Therefore, we can issue certificates that are recognized by the Israeli government, by the Ministry of Religious Affairs, by the rabbinic, the chief rabbinate.
And then women are then able to be the mikvah attendants. It's a fascinating program, and it's a fascinating piece. It's what I find really thrilling about it is that in the United States, everything is decentralized, which should make things easier to change, and everything is centralized in Israel, which should make it harder to change. But it sounds like you figured out a way to work within that centralized system and bring about this important change.
Well, I think the more important change is also creating the opportunity to talk more about things that we didn't used to talk about, and for everybody to feel like they can raise things that are difficult for them. Eden really tries to address issues. We have a whole series of blogs that people are definitely welcome to look up on our website, dealing with all kinds of topics around intimacy, around mikvah, around women's health. And those things are just as important to be talking about, just as mikvah was once really taboo. And here we've just spent half an hour talking about it in a forum that will reach many, many people. We should be able to talk about these topics in ways that will inform us positively and empower us to connect in the way that is meaningful to us.
Well, and on that note, Dr. Grumet, I want to thank you for your time. Our half hour is up. It's been fascinating. It's good to see you, even though you're on the other side of the ocean, or I guess I'm on the other side of the ocean. And please continue to do the amazing work you do. And for everybody who's watching, next week, we will have the privilege of welcoming the Chief Rabbi of Great Britain, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis. And until then, have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.